Hello, I'm Aimee Ng, curator at the Frick Collection in New York, and welcome to another episode of Cocktails with a Curator. One of the rooms that we've had an enormously positive response about in our installation at Frick Madison has been the Porcelain Room, and I'm showing just one of the walls of the Porcelain Room here on the screen. And what is often cited by our jubilant visitors who are seeing this room and feeling so immersed in these walls of porcelain organized by color. Here, a wall of famille verte, so the green family porcelains, is that there's a sense of immersion in this extraordinary art form drawn from both Asia and Europe, but also that they're seeing porcelain for the first time, sometimes as works of art on their own, and not just integrated in the Frick house, for example, among works of sculpture and painting, sitting on top of furniture, etc. This is a chance for us to highlight our holdings of Asian and European porcelain. And it's also a chance to highlight really important, significant pieces within this collection. And this episode is about these two ladies on stands that you see flanking either side of the installation on the central panel. These are over 3 feet tall, hard paste porcelain ladies. That's the best way I can describe them. We don't know their names. Of course, these are not portraits. And as a complementary cocktail, probably the drink that I should be toasting with these ladies in mind would be a little cup of baijiu, which is a liquor, a Chinese liquor made from sorghum, a cereal, also of rice. And it is actually the highest selling alcohol liquor in the world, but it's relatively little known outside of Chinese culture. But I didn't go with baijiu. I decided to go with a cocktail that was a little bit more florid, and that is to pay tribute to the decoration on these ladies' clothing. And so the cocktail that I've chosen today is called a chrysanthemum. The floral decoration that you see is, of course, chrysanthemum flowers. These are an auspicious symbol in Chinese culture, native to China, many, many, many varieties, symbols of good fortune, etc., prosperity. Also, I had a bottle of absinthe that I had to buy last summer to do a cocktail for the Ng portrait of the Comtesse d'Ossenby. And you know what? I wanted to use a little bit of that. So here is a cocktail that I can put a little bit of absinthe in as well. The chrysanthemum is simply some dry vermouth, Bénédictine, absinthe, garnished or not. Cheers. As I said, these figures, the two Chinese ladies on stands, are relatively large. They're over 3 feet tall, and here is a photograph taken by my colleague Gemma McElroy of me in the Porcelain Room, again to give you the sense of their relationship to human scale. I have to admit to a little bit of difficulty getting into the story of these objects, which I'm not a specialist in terms of Asian porcelains. And part of the reason why, and what I'd like to overcome in terms of my own, traditional investigations of European art history, these are made by artists or an artist who has come down to us unidentified. We don't have the names of the artists who made these ladies. And as I said, these are not portraits of anyone. They are, in a sense, idealized female figures. And so, my usual fall back into an investigation into biography and the way that it weaves into the story of the artist is not really at hand for me here. And so really this has been looking and thinking about these objects, a real exercise in the way that art history sort of is approached differently according to different cultures, and even the idea of art and authorship as well. They were made during the Long Qing dynasty, which ran from 1644 to 19 11. And they're made under the Kangxi Emperor, who was the longest ruling emperor in Chinese history from 1662 to 1722. And here's a late portrait of the Kangxi Emperor in Beijing. And to, of course, give some kind of equivalent to what was happening in European art during the time of the Kangxi Emperor's reign. Perhaps at the beginning, we could put around 1662. We could think of Vermeer in Delft making his paintings. You can see those at the Frick, and at the end of the reign of the Kangxi Emperor, 1722. I think of in France Antoine Watteau, sort of the end of Antoine Watteau's life, but the beginning of sort of Rococo, the sort of flourishing of French painting in the 18th century. Of course, China was a very, very complicated, complex place with not a lot of interaction, especially not in trade with Europe at the time. And art would be a little bit different too. Obviously, in the way that it develops, the way that artists are thought of, authorship was thought of as well. Most of what we see of Chinese porcelain was made in the city of Jingdezhen in southern China. And these figures come from this city as well. The most important of the porcelain that was produced in these kilns in Jingdezhen would be reserved for the imperial court. The most spectacular pieces, the most extraordinary, would be reserved for the imperial court. And below that, a certain number was made for export to Europe. And not all of it, of course, was produced at the extremely high quality that our ladies on stands are made in. They're not portraits. They are sort of exemplary of the ideals of female beauty celebrated in this culture at the time. Shapes of the eyes, you can see they're sort of punctured in the pupils with that little hole that allows the sense of a dark pupil at the center of the eye. The ears are also pierced. The little shape of the lips, the narrow nose, very thin eyebrows, that sort of widow's peak of the hairline. And of course, that porcelain light skin. And in this culture, as well as many others, there was this link of the ideal of feminine beauty to a sense of class as well. And especially in this one, sort of the distance of the lightest skin possible from the idea of laboring outside under the sun, doing any work. And so this idea of the privilege of lightness was part of this idea of ideal feminine beauty in this culture. As we look closely at her, we also notice, the little hands that are coming out of these double hanging sleeves, so beautifully framing these hands, which may have at one point held or extended, offered little gifts, maybe fruits or flowers. Again, these two sort of gracious figures, maybe offering gifts as signs of generosity, of welcoming, of kindness, of maybe even a sense of subservience in a way to the viewer who was appreciating their appearance. And I'll just point out, of course, the very, very pointedly filed fingernails of both of them. They have very similar manicures, and that might seem very alien to North American culture, perhaps to the kind of style for manicures on women in the 18th century happening in Europe. But I will say this, I have seen nails like this very popular on the streets of New York right now in the year 2021. So it's interesting the way that some of these styles come in and out through time and geography and various cultures. You can see here very clearly the way that the robes is decorated in a very precise painting in this overglaze. And the two figures are differentiated in the way that their clothing is decorated. One of my favorite details is the way that the robes sort of just turn open a little bit at the bottom. I hope you can see just the way that we can see the underside of those robes as they roll open. And the skirts on the two are decorated differently. Here, that sort of circular pattern, it's some sort of flying stork heightened with gold. Again, this sort of auspicious symbolism. And on the other side, chrysanthemum flowers again. And I hope you can notice too, the way that at the very bottom of those skirts, the pointed toes of the shoes just peeking out from underneath. Again, these very subtle details. Again, very difficult to accomplish these kinds of pristine, precise detailing in porcelain and in overglaze. They stand on these two stands, and I'm showing you side by side to give you a sense of just the small ways that they are differentiated. And they're decorated with these forms that have this swastika-like shape. These are Buddhist symbols called wan, which symbolize good fortune. Again, this auspicious decoration on these stands. These two figures would have been together as a pair, sort of as harbingers of good fortune, of goodness, of prosperity, of beauty, certainly. And I'm showing you this photograph of these two photographs of the two figures off of their stands, and to give you a sense too of the way they stand differently. The one on the right, obviously bending forward, pitching forward much more. And while that might give her a sense of, a little bit more of a bow, a little bit more of that, hint of subservience, what it probably is the result of is a flaw in the firing of these two large-scale porcelain figures. Again, this is another witness to the difficulty of making porcelain at this scale, over 3 feet with the stands, and having that sort of even firing to give them a very, very uniform form and contour. These are called biscuit wares, which to me is one of the most adorable names for a type of art in the world, called this way because the porcelain is fired without a glaze, and that biscuit, that fired porcelain, is then painted with an overglaze as opposed to being glazed and then painted again with an underglaze and an overglaze. It's biscuit ware. And they are, again, of the famille verte categorization. And again, that the fact that the classification is a French name, as opposed to famille noire, famille rose, it gives us that sense of the craze in Europe and particularly in France to collect, to amass these objects of Asian porcelain. When they were being brought over to Europe for export, on all of the global shipping routes, a number of shipwrecks that have recovered a sense of the humongous quantity of porcelains that would come over. And I'll just contrast a photograph like this. This is a photograph published by Bloomberg in a story in 2012 regarding a shipwreck that was recovered off the coast of Indonesia in 2008, with some 700,000 pieces of Ming china, Ming porcelain, 16th century objects, probably a ship that had run aground sometime in the 17th century. To give you the sense that in this photograph, amazing photograph, of the way the porcelain bowls are stacked easily, right? So you can have that sort of maximum efficiency of shipping these hundreds of thousands of objects. Not so with large scale figures like this. The enormous risk of shipping these, the cost, this is not very efficient in terms of fitting them into shipping containers and things like this, wrapping them in whatever kinds of protective material to prevent those delicate nails from chipping off. That these would be extremely valuable objects and extremely difficult and costly also to ship. And so it's believed that very few of these kinds of figures made it to Europe, and they were really prized as really primary and precious objects. Again, probably today, unique specimens at this size and this quality known in the world. And I'll just remind you that the discovery of the secret to making hard paste porcelain in Europe, they'd been trying for centuries to discover how Asian porcelain was made, hard paste porcelain was made. This only took place, traditionally believed, 1708 in Germany. Even after that, the interest in and the taste for and the hunger for Chinese and other Asian porcelains in Europe remained very high. And the earliest record of ownership of these two Chinese figures is in London with the very avid collector of Asian porcelains, George Salting. And in 1903, these two figures pass on to the collection of the American financier, huge collector, as we know, J.P. Morgan, who had his estates in London as well as in New York. And when Morgan acquired them in 1903 for some $14,000 at the time, he had them sent, probably like all of the porcelain that he had acquired, straight pretty much to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, where his enormous collection of porcelains was on public view. And this is a photograph in 1907 of the Morgan collection of porcelains at the Metropolitan Museum. And here is another view of sort of the enormous quantities of Asian porcelains that Morgan had accumulated and put on view in New York City. I should note that the background to this is while these huge quantities of Chinese objects and the Frick's two Chinese ladies came to America around this time, the turn of the century, here in 1903, the two Chinese ladies came. This happened at a time when the vast majority of Chinese people were barred, were not allowed to immigrate to the United States due to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And this prevented the vast majority of Chinese people from coming into the United States. This was an act that was repealed in 1943. With a quota of 105 Chinese immigrants allowed in the country annually in 1943. This obviously has changed since. Morgan died unexpectedly in 1913. And as we know, Frick acquired a number of items from Morgan's collection, famously on view at the Metropolitan Museum at the time. Frick acquired the suite of the Fragonard paintings, the Progress of Love, from Morgan's collection for some astounding amounts, and brought them into his home at 1 East 70th Street. And Frick was convinced by the dealer, Duveen, who pointed out particularly the two Chinese figures, the two ladies on stands, to Frick as some of the most extremely important porcelain that Frick could get his hands on. He convinced Frick to acquire, in 1918, the pair of ladies. And here's a photograph, I'm sorry it's grainy, of 1927 of one visible, but they're both in the room at the time. This is the living hall of the Frick house while it remained a private residence. And this is a little bit of a later photograph that you can see at the far left. One of the Chinese figures integrated into the living hall at a moment when the Frick residence, 1935, has been converted to a public museum. And I'm showing you a more recent, not so great photograph of the living hall, and about 15 years ago, in order to show you that its proximity to works like Titian's and Bellini have been they've been part of this room, the living hall, even if they are overshadowed by some of the European paintings in the room. I also want to draw attention to this particular shot because the Bellini painting, St. Francis in the Deserts, as seen on the wall at left, was acquired around the same time as the two Chinese figures in 1915. And they were, the comparative value of the Bellini painting versus the Kangxi figures of the two ladies on stands is probably surprising to modern viewers now. At the time, Frick acquired the Bellini picture for $170,000, which might be surprising for that low cost now, it being such a famous painting now. The ladies were not so much cheaper than that. Duveen was asking some $130,000 from Frick, and he paid a little bit less than that, maybe $117,000. But again, this idea of it's sort of around the same cost, these two Chinese porcelain figures, and this celebrated Venetian painting, 1470s, of St. Francis in the desert, recently referred to as in the press as the most beautiful painting in America, if not the world. And of course, the fate of Bellini's picture is that, it is astronomical in value, cultural value, it's celebrated at Frick Madison, given now a place, a space of its own Bellini room. The fate and fortune of the two Chinese figures was not so astronomical. It's not that they became much, much more celebrated in value, but they do remain among the most important porcelain pieces at the Frick. And the next time you're able to come to Frick Madison, I invite you to come into the porcelain room and give them a really close look, down to their details, down to their fingernails, because like virtually everything at Frick Madison, these two ladies do really reward a very close and quiet look. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Cocktails with the Curator. We'll see you next time.